Hi Year 12, it is April Fool's Day, the 1st of April, and no joke at all, this is our lesson on chapter 34 of Handmaid's Tale. Please ignore the way that my 16-year-old self spelt the word propaganda. In this chapter we get the actual pre-Gilead ceremony and some more details therefore about the setup of Gilead, and we're just going to jump straight in. So Offred goes back to the present. The sitting space in the courtyard is filled now. We rustle and wait. Remember, they've had the conversation between her and Offred about Janine, and we've seen Janine in the state that she's in after her baby was declared a shredder. At last, the commander in charge of this service comes in. He's balding, squarely built, looks like an ageing football coach, and I think we've got some kind of I've said concrete representations of power here, some of this ritual symbolism, but this description of him like an ageing football coach is that kind of stereotypical Caucasian American male. So a guy who played football when he was in college and now he's older. He's dressed in his uniform, sober black, with rows of insignia and decorations, so that's his medals, what for we're not sure. It's hard not to be impressed, but I make an effort. I try to imagine him in bed with his wife and his handmaid, fertilising away like mad, like rutting salmon, pretending to take no pleasure in it. And we have to ask ourselves here, I mean, we always have these kind of tongue-in-cheek descriptions that are slightly morbid humour by Offred, but ask ourselves description here whether she is less afraid of the power structures in Gilead than she has been before, whether that's as a result of her relationship with the commander or whether that's as a result of her kind of involvement with Offred and the resistance. When the Lord said to be fruitful and multiply, did he mean this man? The commander ascends the steps of the podium, and here we have this kind of ritualistic symbolism of power, which is draped with a red cloth embroidered with a large white winged eye. He gazes over the room, and our soft voices die. He doesn't even have to raise his hands. And again, we have that sense of his power, this omnipresent kind of eye that's watching things. And so it's symbolised by the fact that he doesn't even need to raise his voice. That's how kind of well indoctrinated they are. When his voice goes in the microphone and out through the speakers, robbed of its lower tones, so that it's sharply metallic, as if it's being made, not being made by his mouth, his body, but by the speakers themselves. His voice is metal-coloured, horn-shaped. So we have this tinny and false voice that he has, which again is kind of symbolic of this kind of hollow, echoey, false doctrine of Gilead. And then this horn-shaped voice, way that she describes his voice, a little bit like the devil. Today is a day of thanksgiving, he begins, a day of praise. I tune out the speech about victory and sacrifice. There's a long prayer with about unworthy vessels, and then a hymn. There is a balm in Gilead, and this is actually interestingly an African spiritual. So that is a hymn that would have been sung by slaves on the slave ships or in the plantations in America. And so what's really interesting is that they've appropriated this piece of cultural history that's actually about freedom and oppression and used it for Gilead. And then Moira changes it. There's a bomb in Gilead was what Moira used to call it. And of course that reference there to the constant violence, but also the resistance. Now comes the main item. The 20 angels enter, newly returned from the front, newly decorated. So these angels have proved themselves worthy by fighting on the front line, being very brave and heroic. So they are rewarded with a wife, accompanied by their honour guards, marching 1, 2, 1, 2 to the central open space Attention, at ease. And now the 20 veiled daughters in white come shyly forward, their mothers holding their elbows. It's mothers, not fathers, who give away daughters these days. Help with the arrangement of the marriages. And again, we have this idea that this female collusion, this matriarchal power in Gilead is very important. This idea of women controlling women. And so the marriages are arranged, of course, as Offred says here, but they're arranged by mothers. The marriages are, of course, arranged. These girls haven't been allowed to be alone with a man for years, for however many years they've been doing this. And again, we have that sense that Offred's memory is kind of slipping out of her grasp a little bit. Are they old enough to remember anything of the time before? Playing baseball in jeans, sneakers, riding their bicycles, reading books by themselves, even though some of them are no more than 14. And so again, we have that sense here of this idea of growing up in Gilead, that there will come a time when the girls that are being married off in this Pravaganza wedding are children of Gilead. And then we have some of this justification. So they are being married off, some of them at no more than 14 years old. Start them soon is the policy. There's not a moment to be lost. And this, of course, is because of the infertility crisis. Still, they'll remember. And the ones after them will for 3 or 4 or 5 years. But after won't they? After that they won't. They'll have always been white in groups of girls. They'll have always been silent. And so this fear that Offred has for the future and what that looks like. Interestingly, in here we have the inversion of some real world thinking. We have a fear of teenage pregnancy, and yet this is something that Gilead encourages. And then, of course, while there isn't anything specific in this section about paedophilia, you know, soldiers fighting on the front lines probably aren't going to be 14 years old or 16 years old. And so we have a sense there of this kind of, again, some of the traditional civilized liberal thinking has been inverted in order to fix this population crisis. We've given them more than we've taken away, said the commander. And so in this moment, again, because we've got this lovely fragmented narrative, we have Offred slipping into a discussion with the commander where he's trying to justify this difference between freedom and sacrifice. Think of all the trouble they had before, that's these women. Don't you remember the singles bars, the indignity of high school blind dates, the meat market, which of course is, you know, the clubs that you go to where people are looking to hook up? Don't you remember the terrible gap between the ones who could get a man easily and the ones who couldn't? Some of them were desperate. They starved themselves thin, pumped up their breasts full of silicone, cut their noses off. Think of the human misery. And in this section with the commander, we do have a lot of legitimate, agreeable criticisms of Western culture. And this bit is this the criticism here of this beauty-centric female culture, where, you know, women are driven to all sorts of desperate actions in order to secure a mate. He waved his hand at stacks of old magazines. They were always complaining. Problems this, problems that. Remember the ads in the personal columns? Bright, attractive woman, 35. This way, they all get a man. Nobody's left out. And so we have that sense of equality. It seems fair. And if they did then, and then if they did marry, they could be left with a kid or 2 kids. The husband might just get fed up and take off, disappear. They'd have to go on welfare, which is benefits, or else he'd stay around and beat them up. If they had a job, the children in daycare and left with some brutal, ignorant woman, and they'd have to pay for that themselves out of their wretched little paychecks. Money was the only measure of worth for everyone. They got no respect as mothers. No wonder they were giving up the whole business. This way, they're protected. They can fulfill their biological duties in peace. And so we have this kind of realistic depiction of the kind of the brutality of what it's like to be working and to have a child and to be a working parent and to be left or beaten up. And again, in a lot of ways, the commander, the picture that he's painting of pre-Gilead America is very realistic, and it's those criticisms of liberal society that have some truth. All of these things happen every day in reality, and so Gilead has fixed that, and that underpins the kind of the dogma of Gilead. And even today we see this kind of push, money is the only measure of worth, and then no wonder they were giving up on the whole business. And this again, no wonder women were giving up on the whole business of being working and being a wife and a mother. And we see that with the increase of women who are choosing to stay at home as mothers. And then we have this way they're protected. They can still fulfill their biological destinies, which is to be a mother, in peace with full support and encouragement. Now you tell me, you're an intelligent person. I like to hear what you think. What did we overlook? And of course, because these marriages are arranged, there is no, on the outside, there is no divorce, there's no leaving, this is a kind of marriage for life. And so they have solved some of these problems here. Of course, we don't know what happens behind closed doors, but if the commander's household is anything to go by, then all of these problems haven't in fact been fixed. They've just been glossed over. What did we overlook? Love, I said. Love, said the commander. What kind of love? Falling in love, I said. And of course, we've discussed this before, but this idea that Offred is romantic at heart. The commander looked at me with his candid boy's eyes. Ah, yes, he said. I've read the magazines. That's what they were pushing, wasn't it? And so this idea in the magazines, they're selling something. They're persuading you this is a false thing. But look at the stats, my dear. Was it really worth it, falling in love? And of course, the stats that he talks about are the stats about divorce, the stats about domestic violence. Arranged marriages have always worked out just as well, if not better. And so this is then the challenge, the difference between ideology, arranged marriage works out, and practicality. And then we have Aunt Lydia, love, said Aunt Lydia with distaste. Don't let me catch you at it. No mooning or juning here, girls, wagging her finger at us. Love is not the point. And of course, we have this use of Offred's real name in here, which is potentially foreshadowing the idea that maybe she does moon, maybe she does fall in love. And then we go back to the commander, so we have this fragmented narrative. Those years were just an anomaly, historically speaking, the commander said. Just a fluke. All we've done is return to nature's norm. And what he means is those years were an anomaly, historically speaking, is the centuries of civilization where people haven't been doing these kind of traditional domestic roles. And in a lot of ways, that reminds me a lot of our conversations about the natural man and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and that idea that it's society that corrupts us, and people that go back to the natural kind of primitive, simple way of living are the better people. And of course, that's one of the things that Gilead is supporting. Women's prayervaganzas are for group weddings like this, usually. The men's are for military victories. So again, we have these very clearly defined gendered activities. These are things we're supposed to rejoice in the most, respectively. Sometimes, though, for women, they are for a nun who recants. So obviously a nun who's a woman that's taken a vow of celibacy and often lives in a nunnery or another religious convent. And so a nun who recants her vow is a woman that goes back on her vow of celibacy, because obviously the vow of celibacy itself is seen as a sin in Gilead. And so we have, again, Offred just giving us these hints that this very topsy-turvy world that Gilead has created have these ripples that go and affect so many different groups. And we might say a nun is someone who's chosen to dedicate themselves to Christ. You know, they often say that they're married to the church or married to Christ and therefore have no need for marriage. And that's a very extreme commitment. And yet in Gilead, that's a sin. Most of that, so these nuns who recant their vow, happened earlier when they were rounding them up. But they still unearthed a few these days, dredge them up from the underground where they've been hiding like moles, because of course if you had that depth of religious commitment, it wouldn't be something that you'd want to go back on easily or quickly. They have a look about them too, weak-eyed, stunned by too much light. The old ones they send off to the colonies right away, but the young fertile ones they try to convert, and when they succeed, we all come here to watch them go through the ceremony, not the ceremony, but the ceremony where they renounce their celibacy, sacrifice it to the common goods. They kneel and the commander prays, and they take the red veil like the rest of us have done. They aren't allowed to become wives though. They're considered still too dangerous for positions of such power. And so again, we have another kind of type of woman that's being forced to be a handmaid. And of course, again, the degradation of that, someone who's taken a vow of celibacy, then being forced to be a handmaid. But it's too dangerous to give them the freedom to become a wife. There's an odour of witch about them, something mysterious, exotic. It remains despite the scrubbing and the welts on their feet and the time they've spent in solitary. They'll always have those welts. They've always done that time. So rumour goes. They don't let go easily. Many of them choose the colonies instead. And so these women, these ones who are kind of overcommitted to this way of living, it's almost like they are impossible to kind of indoctrinate completely. And they're, in a lot of ways, the state has to break them rather than re-educate them. And there's a sort of fear about them. None of us like to draw one of them for a shopping partner. They are more broken than the rest of us. It's hard to feel comfortable with them. The mothers, so we go back to the Pravaganza, have stood the white veiled girls in place and returned to their chairs. There's a little crying going on among them, some mutual patting and hand holding. The ostentatious use of handkerchiefs, ostentatious means kind of outwardly obvious. The commander continues with the service, and then we have this section of the service, which interestingly is lifted almost exactly from the New Testament. It's from the book of 1 Timothy, and it's chapter 2 of 1 Timothy, and it's quite a controversial section of the New Testament. It's not written by someone called Timothy, it's written to someone called Timothy, who is one of the kind of Christian missionaries who's taken the word of God out of Jerusalem, out of Israel, and is actually in Ephesus, which is in Greece, and he is receiving instructions on how to teach the local people to behave in a Christ-like way. And what's interesting, it's often attributed to the Apostle Peter, this, but it's a piece of the New Testament that is much argued about in the church. So the commander reads, I will, and this is, like I said, it's lifted directly almost from the King James version of the Bible, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, he said, with shamefacedness, so that's it, kind of embarrassment, and sobriety, which is seriousness, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly array, but which becometh women professing godliness with good works. Let the women learn in silence with all subjection. And then he looks over at us and they all repeat, all he repeats, and of course it is not repeated in the Bible, he gives that extra emphasis. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was first formed, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but women, being deceived, was in the transgression. Notwithstanding, she shall be saved by childbearing, if they continue in faith and charity and holiness with sobriety. And again, so we've got all sorts of stuff there in the Bible, this biblical precedence. We've talked about being saved through childbearing. We've got this idea of silence, and we know that they've altered the Beatitudes to blessed be the silent. And then we have the biblical precedent for their kind of uniforms. They've not got braided hair or gold or pearls. So we have this kind of very, very uber strict religious doctrine here. So saved by childbearing. Saved by childbearing, I think. What did we suppose would save us in the time before? And so, of course, that question about how is that applied? He should tell that to the wives. Offglen murmurs when they're into their sherry and that idea of sobriety and being sober. The wives aren't that into sobriety. She means the part about sobriety. It's safe to talk again. The commander has finished the main ritual. Finished the main ritual, and they're doing the rings, lifting the veils. Boo, I think in my head. And we have some questions here about this. Their marriages are arranged by the mothers, and so you assume that the angels know who they're marrying, although they are described as being freshly returned from the front. And so here we have this sense that potentially this is the first time that they're seeing each other. And so she lifts that as they lift the veils, Offred is like boo, as in a shock, a surprise. And then she says, take a good look, because it's too late now. The angels will qualify for handmaids later, especially if their new wives can't produce. But you girls are stuck. That's what you see is what you get, zits and all. But you aren't expected to love him. You'll find out soon enough. Your duty, you just do your duty in silence. When in doubt, lay flat on your back and look at the ceiling. Who knows what you may find up there? Funeral wreaths, angels, constellations of dust, stellar or otherwise, puzzles left by spiders. There's always something to occupy the inquiring mind. And again, just that sense that there is kind of this cynicism of Offred, comparing their experiences that these young girls will have to her experience, and suggesting that potentially there isn't that much difference after all. Is there anything wrong, dear? The old joke went. And this is a kind of old-fashioned Victorian sex joke. No, why? You moved. Just don't move. So the joke here is that, you know, that during the missionary position, you know, a woman is, you know, in theory meant to lie still and think of England. There's not meant to be any pleasure there for the woman. She's meant to be totally passive. And so if she moves, then this sexual act becomes about her pleasure and not about his pleasure, which is, of course, the point of the patriarchal system. All right. What we're aiming for, says Aunt Lydia, is a spirit of camaraderie among women. We must all pull together. And so we have this feminist principle, and we have this kind of sense of talking about this kind of women together, camaraderie shit. Moira through the hole in the toilet cubicle. Right fucking on, Aunt Lydia, as they used to say. How much do you want to bet she's got Janine down on her knees? We've got very coarse and crude pseudo-male description here, a language used by Moira here. What do you think they get up to in that office of hers? I bet she's got her working away on that dried up, hairy, old, withered... Moira, I say. Moira, what, she whispers. You know you've thought it. Doesn't do any good to talk like that, I say, feeling nevertheless the impulse to giggle. I still pretended to myself then that we should try and preserve something resembling dignity. You always were such a wimp, said Moira says, but with affection. It does do good, it does. And she's right. I know that now as I kneel in this undeniably hard floor, listening to this ceremony drone on. There's something powerful in the whispering of obscenities about those in power. And again, so we have that idea of her inner resistance, that kind of survival. There's something delightful about it, something naughty, secretive, forbidden, thrilling. It's like a spell of sorts. It deflates them, and the them there is the people in power, reduces them to the common denominator where they can be dealt with. In the paint of the washroom cubicle, someone unknown has scratched Aunt Lydia sucks. It was like a flag waved from a hilltop in rebellion. The mere idea of Aunt Lydia doing such a thing was in itself heartening. And so again, we've got that like a flag on the hilltop, which was the symbolism that was used of Janine when she was pregnant, as a kind of symbol of hope. And this is a different symbol, a symbol of rebellion, a symbol of hope, just like the message scratched on the inside of her cupboard door. This sense that these things reduces the power that the authority has over them. So now I imagine among these angels and their drained white brides, momentous grunts sweating, damp furry encounters, or better, ignominious failures, cocks, like 3-week-old carrots, anguished fumblings, upon flesh cold unresponded, as cooked fish. And so we have this morbid humour in another way that she potentially copes with this moment, is this kind of turning it into something ridiculous. And this sense of humour that Offred has is a real kind of facet of her character. When it's over at last and we're walking out, so this is the prayer vaganza, Offglen says to me in her light, penetrating whisper, "We know you're seeing him alone." And we have to ask ourselves, who is Offglen's spy? How does she know this? Is it openly on the grapevine because the commander is talking about it? Or is there another spy in her household? Who, I say, resisting the urge to look at her. I know who. Your commander, she says. We know you've been. I ask her how. We just know, she says. What does he want? Kinky sex? It would be hard to explain to her what he does want, because I still have no name for it. How can I describe what really goes on between us? She would laugh, for one thing. It's easier for me to say, in a way, and of course, even though I've told you that he's about to kind of take her to this club, where he does in fact want kinky sex, when she says in a way, she's also not lying, because it's like the kind of extended build-up to sex. That at least has the dignity of coercion. She thinks about this. You'd be surprised, she says, how many of them do this, how many of them do want kinky sex. This idea of being the kind of the danger and the desire. I can't help it, she says. I can't say I won't go. It's interested with the can't help it, the fact that it's almost like she can't stop herself. She doesn't say, I can't say no. She says that second. And so we have this sense that there is something about her that's enjoying this. She ought to know that. We're on the sidewalk now. It's not safe to talk. We're too close to the others, and the protective whispering of the crowd is gone. We walk in silence, lagging behind, until finally she judges she can say, of course you can't. But find out and tell us. Find out what, I say. I feel rather than see the slight turning of her head. Anything you can. And of now, of course, to add these kind of enormous layers of complexity, Offred becomes a spy. And that's the end of this chapter. If I can turn it off.